Okay, so I think that's everybody in. I'll get started. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you might be. That spans even just our panel today. So we know we have people all over. My name is Rebecca Schendel. I'm the Managing Director of the Center for International Higher Education. And it's great to see you all here at our monthly webinar series and our April contribution. I want to get some of the housekeeping out of the way. Some of you who come frequently to our webinars will know this already, but if you do not, a few tips. One is that we do recommend you use the speaker view in Zoom, because that's usually the best way to see the speakers most clearly. We also ask that you mute yourself and turn off your video, because that allows us to spotlight the panelists. And please use the chat function for any questions you might want to ask. And it's important to say you don't need to wait to the end for that. As questions occur to you, please feel free to go ahead and put them in the chat and we'll get to them a little bit later in the session. And then last but not least, just a reminder that we do record our webinars and we upload them to our YouTube channel at the end. So with that, without further ado and all of that out of the way, to turn to the far more interesting content, which is the focus of today's webinar. So you'll have noticed that we entitled our webinar quite generically, Alternative Models of Higher Education Today. We deliberately chose to avoid adding too much detail to that title because we wanted to do our best to avoid constraining where this conversation might go. But I'm sure you're all here because you have at least some interest in how higher education might be done differently by particular institutions or groups of institutions in the world. And that's certainly what we're hoping to show today. Those of you who've attended our webinars in the past will be used to the fact that we generally do quite a traditional format where we have a few panelists who give presentations and then questions and answers at the end, but we're going to do things a little bit differently today. I have a hunch that we'll get more out of this conversation if we privilege dialogue over presentation, so dialogue between the speakers and also between the speakers and all of you. So instead of doing formal presentations, what we've done is I've prepared a series of questions which I'd like to pose to our panelists. And my hope is that the answers to those questions will take maybe 40 minutes or so, and that hopefully those of you who are listening will then be inspired enough by that conversation to add your own questions to the mix that we can engage with in the last 20 minutes or so of the hour. So as I said, feel free to post those questions in the chat as they occur to you. No need to wait to the end. So without further ado, let me introduce our panelists for today. So Nhlanhla Thwala is the provost of the African Leadership University. I'll leave it to him to explain ALU to you, but I will just note that this is an individual who has extensive experience in what you might call traditional higher education, as well as his role currently at ALU. So he's taught at Indiana University in Bloomington and is faculty member and department head at Wits University in South Africa, and has also worked for some businesses affiliated with the higher ed sector, including CIHE Education Group and the Pearson Institute. So welcome, Nhlanhla. And we also have Mandel and Kelly Teamey, who are joining us from Hawaii today. They helped to found the Ecoversities Alliance in 2015. Having worked for a number of years in, again, what you might call traditional higher education in the UK, they left the UK in 2012 and embarked on a year-long sojourn around the world with the goal of learning as much as they could about alternative models and approaches to higher education, and also documenting that through the Enlivened Learning Project. If you're interested, I'll put the link to that up in the chat for later. And then the Ecoversities Alliance was born out of that sojourn, and I'll let them explain that a little bit to you. So thank you all again for joining us today. And to start off, I'm hoping that those of you on the panel can share a few details with us about the institutions that you represent, or in the case of Udi and Kelly, the kinds of institutions that work with the Alliance. And so for those in the audience who might be less familiar with the models that you work with, it'd be great if you could just explain a little bit more about how they function, whether that's the kinds of students that attend and the type of learning those students encounter, but also what other kinds of functions of the more dominant model of higher ed can be found at these institutions. So things like research, community engagement, service, etc. So Nhlanhla, would you be happy if I started with you?
Yes, that is okay with me. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, good. Thank you for the invitation, and it's my pleasure to be here with you today. It's a bit late in the night, but I hope I'll still be coherent. Let me talk just a little bit about the model and ALU, what we do, and the type of students we have, as well as what our aim is as an institution. ALU is a network of education as well as professional networks. ALU is a university in accredited in Rwanda. We have 2 campuses. One campus is in Rwanda, in Kigali, and we have another campus in Mauritius. The campus in Mauritius is called African Leadership College, and we have a partnership there with Glasgow Caledonian University. That is just because in Mauritius, an institution cannot start and offer its own accreditation or its own qualifications. From day one, we have to serve something like an apprenticeship for 10 years under a recognized university. So we're on our 7th year in that relationship, and we hope that in the next few years, after the 10th year, we'll be able to offer our own independent qualifications. For now, our qualifications are conferred by Glasgow Caledonian University. But in Rwanda, we have our own independent accreditation, accredited in Rwanda by the Higher Education Commission. And yeah, we have a campus there, which is purpose-built for our students. In terms of the students that we have in Rwanda, most of them, 50% of them are Rwandese, and then the other 50% come from outside Rwanda. They come really across the spectrum in Africa. We have more than 16 nations represented by our students. They are mostly undergraduate students, but we also have a business school, the ALU SB Business School, which has been running for the last 5 years. So we have postgrad and undergraduate programs because of those 2. Primarily, our students come straight from high school. 50% of them come, 50 to 60% of them come straight from high school, but other students come from other tertiary experience. They've been to other universities. Some of them have even finished degrees from other universities. So we have a mix of the students that come there. The profile of student who comes to ALU is really one who is prepared to lead. We encourage them very early on in the application to indicate their interest in leadership, because we're a leadership university, and for them to be interested also in entrepreneurship, because our value really is developing leaders for Africa's next century. So that's the rough profile I can give about ALU, what we do, and as well as the spread of the students. Our faculty come from all over the world as well, and we offer several qualifications. We've been offering 5 qualifications in Rwanda and 4 in Mauritius. We will, in the next few years, be moving to just 2 qualifications. One, which is software engineering, and the other one, what we call Bachelor of Entrepreneurial Leadership. And the reason for that is because we want to focus on the leadership and then technology, and then see how those 2 can be used to address Africa's challenges and Africa's opportunities. Yeah, I don't know if you have any further questions that I could focus on.
Would you mind saying a little bit about the model of how the learning is delivered? I think that's one of the things that makes ALU quite different from a sort of traditional university. So where the coursework comes from, how students engage with it, how it looks different from other universities on the continent.
Yeah, the pillar of our learning is self-directed learning. We take the view that the most important thing about learning is that it has to be directed by the student. Our particular approach to that is what we call missions, not majors. That is, when students arrive at our institution, the first thing they have to address is what do they want to study for, and what is their passion, and what is the challenge or the opportunity that they want to focus on. So they really need to work on their mission. But in addition to that, we help students figure out how to lead themselves and how to lead others, and then as well as how to use information and data in decision-making, because those we think are the pillars that underpin their understanding of what they are learning, as well as purposing the learning that we need to help them with, or help them curate to address a particular mission. So part 1 is you come in, you address your mission, and then we give you those fundamentals, what we call the foundational skills to lead. The second part then is what we call core methods. The core methods address the research skills as well as other skills that you may require in order to interact with literature or knowledge, as well as with problems. So the core methods is the second layer of of learning that the students have to address. And lastly, the students have to address a specific discipline that they want to work with, or a specific area of knowledge, if not a discipline, because our aim really is not to produce specialists in the disciplines, but to produce catalysts for change or catalysts for leading, as opposed to be really specialists in particular niche areas. So our model is about the student purposing learning for their own mission. And we don't really favor the approach of coming in with, this is the curriculum that you must take and it was prepared by us, we'll assess you against it. It's the opposite. We're working with the student's mission and how to curate learning to serve a particular mission. That is what is unique about the model. Of course, it throws up a whole lot of problems if you're looking at it from a traditional point of view in terms of how do you assess, how do you support each student, because there are many areas that the students can choose in terms of what they want to learn. But the issue here for us is how to help students regulate their own learning, purpose it in the direction of their mission, but then we push them in terms of making sure that they achieve the intellectual rigor, but also they action their results in terms of either a capstone or particular venture. And some students, of course, want to go to graduate school, and we help them, write those essays and prepare that research that will enable them to go to graduate school.
Thank you so much. That's really helpful. And I want to turn to Udi and Kelly, but just really briefly, in terms of the other functions of traditional higher education, could you address that briefly as to whether there's research or community engagement, or do you see yourselves largely as a teaching institution?
Yeah, we see ourselves largely as a teaching institution. We don't see ourselves largely as a research institution. So we do have research, but it's action research as opposed to almost like discipline research. There is community engagement, of course. Our students have to go and prototype their solutions in the communities in which they live, but also they do internships. So there is community engagement in those forms. They take place. Another area that I would like to address is the issue of the role of faculty. In our institution, the role of faculty is to assist the students learn, as opposed to the faculty being a sage on stage, like demonstrating their knowledge to students. It's the opposite. We're looking for them to facilitate the learning of the students. And that's it's not really pedagogy, it's a move away from pedagogy into a self-directed learning approach.
Great. Udi and Kelly.
Thank you for that. And aloha, everybody. Greetings from Hawaii right now. Thanks so much, Rebecca, for bringing us together in this. And we're really excited to share some of the learning and work and experience we've had with the Ecoversities Alliance over the last 7 years since it started. And just as a quick preamble, connecting with how Rebecca, thank you for that generous introduction, that one of the seeds of the Ecoversities Alliance was this learning journey, if you like, of going around the world and seeing how much was going on in terms of places that were reimagining higher education from the ground up in lots of localities, also coming from different knowledges, often also indigenous knowledges and local knowledges, also from social and ecological movements. So the journey that we did, where we traveled to a number of countries around the world and connected to really exciting educators around the world, was a beginning of a weaving together of many of these places. And so that in 2015, when we gathered for the first time, bringing together a number of these places, that's when the Ecoversities Alliance emerged. So to say, we're not in any sense a traditional university or a traditional institution. We are an alliance, a community of practice, a community of educational practitioners. And I would say that, the thing that has brought us together and continues to bring us together and connect with people from doing really exciting work, reimagining education in different parts of the world, is really this kind of central question of what might the university look like if it were at the service of our diverse ecologies, cultures, economies, spiritualities, and life within our planetary home. So there's something about the deeper questioning of what is the university for? What should the university be about? Which all of these experiments are also working with, that has brought us together. And so that's one of the reasons that we call ourselves Ecoversities, prioritizing the oikos, which is both obviously the origin of ecology and economy, but at root it means home. So the key question is what does it mean to create knowledge and learning within and for our planetary home? So this kind of question is one that gathers together the multiple members, member organizations in the Ecoversities Alliance. The other one is a set of values, which you can see more from our website, which is posted on the chat there. But and Kelly will talk more about them. But I'll just mention that similar to the African Leadership University too, that there's an emphasis on self-designed and experiential learning. That's an important part of it. There's also key emphasis on learning in place or in placement. There's a lot of experiments that are connected to decolonizing knowledge and the university. And key, especially for us as an alliance, is this emphasis on inter or transcultural dialogue. So the sense that there are multiple ways of knowing, multiple ontologies and epistemologies, and it's a really amazing space through which we can exchange this across these different ways of knowing as well, the alliances. And so, what is an ecoversity then? One thing that we did find out and continue now as people gather within the alliance is that there are these places that have really come from the ground up. They're also really connected with what are the local issues that are going on in their region or their area or their country. They are creating different practices and interventions and knowledge to directly engage with those. So it's different from a different kind of model of higher education where the abstracted knowledge comes from somewhere else and a building literally is imposed on a place, but these are places that have emerged from and are deeply connected to their communities. In terms of who they are and where they are, and Kelly will talk a bit about the students too, but the organizations now that comprise the Alliance, there's over 260 organizations, and they range from more informal places of adult learning. That could be just a handful of people gathering, but who are deeply connected with these questions, these values. And Kelly mentioned more about the approaches and themes in a little while. But there are also more traditional and conventional universities, including university departments of conventional universities that also feel very allied to these themes, approaches, values, and questions, and that they are part of the Alliance too. Just very briefly, I'll say a little bit about the Alliance in terms of how we organize ourselves. So the Alliance meets regularly once a year, less often because of the pandemic, although we did do a lot of online gathering, but we have a planetary gathering every year or so that happens, that brings everybody together, all the members together. We just had one in Egypt just a few weeks ago. There are also a number of regional gatherings that happen. We have very strong regional networks, especially in Latin America and India and Indian subcontinent. But we also have, in total, over 50 countries represented in the Alliance. So we are present in pretty much whole continents, even if it's a handful of projects. But one really exciting thing about the Alliance is its diversity. It's linguistic and knowledge diversity too. So we have over 50 languages spoken in the Alliance, and that includes a number of initiatives, projects that are directly connected to Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous communities too, and that comprise about a quarter of them. Other ways that we organize is collectively through different seminars and workshops, regionally or online. Also in collective projects, publications and research. We do that as well across these different initiatives. We sponsor visiting residencies or learning journeys where people spend time in each other's organizations as mainly as kind of faculty and as educators, but increasingly I think also the students amongst these initiatives are beginning to circulate more between places too, which is really exciting. Just one other thing to mention, and we'll pick this up again I think in subsequent questions, is that one really important learning that we've had both as people who worked in academia and have stepped out and also are rediscovering these different experiments in different parts of the world is that to reimagine higher education, it's not enough to just reimagine pedagogy, that you really have to reimagine leadership, organizational structure and economy. And I think one thing that we're experimenting with as an alliance is exactly doing these kinds of things. So we organized in a more holacracy-inspired way of more horizontal and organized around different circles. So the different circles are responsible for different parts of the alliance. And you know, so as with all of these things, it's an ongoing experiment. But that we feel that one key aspect of this is that it creates a different kind of culture. And I think that's one thing that we'd like to speak to in a little while. Do you want to say?
I think we'll just, yeah, I think I'll speak later, I think.
Thank you.
I'm trying to keep to some time. I know it's hard to explain all this in a short amount of time, so.
We always have this problem with our webinars. Well, we will open out a little bit. And I think actually the rest of the conversation can be a little bit more dialogic in terms of, you know, you don't have to necessarily present and then present if I think there are themes across. But I guess if we broaden out from the particular institutions you work with to thinking more broadly about what it is that these institutions are sort of pushing against. So all of them are seeking in some way to reject or move away from or do something different from the traditional sort of model of higher education. When I say traditional, I recognize actually it's not traditional, but the largely Western model of higher education that you can see we're converging around all over the world that is most dominant. I suppose that's an easy word to use. So it would be great if you could each talk to what it is about that dominant model that the different institutions you're working with or work for are rejecting. So what is it that needs to be rejected according to the institutions that you work with? And how do the institutions that you work with seek to do that? How do they seek to address the concerns that they see in the dominant model of higher education? Kelly, shall I let you go first since you got no chance at all last time?
Yeah, thanks, Udi. Sure. I mean, I know Udi's kind of hinted at some of it. I think first to say that within Ecoversities, you know, Udi mentioned the inter-transcultural dialogue. I mean, we are constantly, when he's saying experimenting, he's being quite diplomatic. I mean, we have really healthy debates about what is an ecoversity, what is a university, because I think there is no, the whole idea is that it's supposed to be expansive, it's supposed to be open, and that's really what we're aiming for. So instead of a kind of complete rejection, it's like, how can you open it up? How can you bring in other ways of organizing knowledge production, knowledge dissemination in very different ways that are just more relevant to where these places of learning are. And so with that in mind, and also coming from the system, you know, long time as a student, long time as a teacher and a researcher, there's kind of four key areas I think Ecoversities is trying to, I don't know if I want to say, I want to use the word resist rather than reject, but I think it's around the kind of tendency for neoliberal, the neoliberal university, which is a key attribute of today's more conventional university that is organized largely around money making, around market logic, money making. I mean, in a lot of places in the world, because while we were traveling, we were also visiting conventional universities as much as alternative, just trying to see what some of the issues were. And from a former faculty member positioning, really interesting on both ends, really. So rethinking the commodification of all aspects of universities, which it's in a lot of ways, in different ways, it's actually become. The second one is the tendency of managerialism, dominating hierarchy, bureaucracy. You know, a lot more people within the university hired in administration and marketing versus faculty, where now we have 70 to 80% of faculty hired only as adjuncts. And so I think, you know, some of that we're resisting, rejecting. But I think one of the more one of the aspects that tends to be less looked at is the epistemological realm. And that's really what we've been focusing on, is how can you bring together different ways of knowing? We've been exploring the concept and practice of the cosmopolitical. So how do you bring different cosmologies together? How can you learn through those? How can those begin a dialogue? Many of us come from the premise of we cannot solve our problems using the same knowledge systems in which these problems were created in the first place. And that's what universities tend to reproduce. They tend to reproduce, and I say tend because I don't think it is. Universities are also bastions of free thinking on many levels, bastions of, new knowledge forming, which are really important, but they still seem to be quite rigid, quite narrow, whereas we're really trying to open that up. So how can there be a diversity of knowledge systems, not as a kind of last class in a course scenario, which it tends to be, but how can it be equally balanced, equally recognized? How can it be what Boaventura de Sousa Santos calls the ecology of knowledges, a diversity of knowledges coming together? And I think finally is the ecological. How can what we learn, what we teach, what we practice be connected with the place that the learning is situated in? How can we learn the indigenous words, the indigenous knowledge systems around those ecologies? How can we, instead of focusing on technological fixes, which it tends to be, how can that be brought back to the ecological in a diverse way? So those four areas of neoliberal, managerial, epistemological, and ecological are some of the themes, I think, that bring together some of the resistance of what it is we're trying to rethink and redo.
Thank you so much. Nhlanhla, do you want to come in on that question?
Yes, there are some key areas of what we may call the dominant model that we resist. We don't completely reject the notion of a university, but there are some elements within the dominant model that we think need rethinking. The first part that contextualizes the African Leadership University is what is the problem we're trying to address. And the problem is really situated around three concepts. The first one is access. If you look at the African continent and its population and where it's going, and you look at access to university education, you quickly realize that it is woefully inadequate. Only 9% of secondary school leavers get a chance at tertiary level. Much fewer than that exit, okay? So there is a problem of just getting a seat to get a university education. Now, if you try to go down that path of asking what is the problem, you quickly realize that it's the model. The model is unscalable. Okay, the model of a Western university that we have inherited in Africa is not something we can afford in the next 100 years. So we do not have the resources to build all of these facilities and hire all of these professors and educate our people in the short time that we have. So the model cannot work for us because we can't afford it and we don't have the time to actually address the problem in the current model. Okay, so that's point number one. Though we love it, we just don't think it's the solution for Africa. The second issue is accessibility in terms of the individuals trying to get to university. It's expensive. In our calculation, it will cost each student, just for tuition, $28,000 to finish an undergraduate degree. That is a sum that is unreachable for most people. And we can't rely on the government to provide subsidies or scholarships for those students. So it's inaccessible in terms of the institution itself, but even for people to get in, okay? And the third problem we're addressing is the issue of where will we get the armies of professors to teach? They're not there, and we need to do this rather fast because our population is very young and it's growing. By 2035, we'll have the largest population in the world and very youthful too. So that's where we start. The current model cannot serve the needs of the continent in terms of what it needs to do. Now, the fourth element we're dealing with is that in our view, most university education does not produce leadership. It actually produces people who are supposed to go into a university, get some skills, what we call the parts business, and go and fit into some kind of area where they need to be employed. Now, in Africa, we have this paradox. We don't have enough people exiting university, okay? There are just very few of them. But of the few of them who do exit, they're unemployable. So there is a misalignment between the students who exit university or the graduates and the employment economy, but also they are not educated to deal with the challenges and the opportunities of the environment. So those are some of the issues we're trying to deal with. So now, how does this relate to what we're doing? First, we want to produce leaders, but the second part is that if you're going to scale this model, you have to rely on something else other than pedagogy. You have to rely on experiential learning. We have to bring in more people to the value chain of the education. But even the end objectives have to be different. In other words, we cannot educate people for employment. We have to educate people so that they can lead or generate opportunities, take advantages of opportunities, or address Africa's many challenges that we face. So those are some of the issues that we're trying to address. We're trying to address macro issues that affect the whole continent, but we're also looking at the individual. What does the individual want to do? What do you want to do with your education when you finish? How can you live a life of impact in your society and add value instead of wanting to just look for a job? So those are some of the things that we're trying to address. So our model really is do something, learn around your mission. That's number one. Number two, learn by doing, okay? Because there are many more opportunities of learning by doing and then acquiring the skills to reflect what you are learning. And then the other part then is access. There's access in terms of financials, but there's also access in terms of knowledge, the epistemic access. What knowledge is valid and valid to whom and how can you leverage it? Okay. So those are some of the issues we're dealing with. Of course, issues around research and all of those, we value them. But at this stage of our development, we're focusing really more on the teaching and the learning and the graduates as opposed to developing that knowledge. We will develop knowledge along the way, but it's not in the traditional form of the professors doing all the research. It's the students also contributing to the research praxis as well as the institution. Thank you.
I think in the interest of time, I want to move to the next question, but I think it might be worthwhile just spending a minute explaining the faculty model at ALU. I'm not sure you had a chance to do that, but in terms of who the faculty are, it's quite different from your conventional university. Yeah. So I think it's worth just a sentence or two on that.
Yeah. So the faculty is divided into three parts, okay? Then we have the mission specialists, the people who come in and help students curate missions. In other words, help students understand if this is your mission, what are the precedents that you will have to look at and what is the experience that you need to get? And so in a way, with the learning contract part of it, what are you supposed to learn? And then there is the area of coaching. In other words, instead of hiring faculty, to teach, we hire faculty to help students curate the learning, but also to coach students and encourage them to move on. Because we are aware that self-regulated learning is something that is learned itself. It's not something that you should acquire immediately. And then the third element is that we provide a vast network of social psycho support so that students can have both in-person, but also virtual support to help them overcome some of the challenges they face. I mean, during the pandemic, we saw that most of our students struggled with motivation and coping with their learning. So providing that vast network of students or faculty to support them. And lastly, we encourage, and we have lots of people who come in as visiting faculty, who will then participate in supporting the students, either at the specialist level or at the mission level.
Thank you. I think that's helpful. I'm going to combine the last two questions because I think they're quite combinable, and that will give us a little time also to take some of the questions that are starting to come in from the audience. So I guess to put it all together, what I wanted to ask at the end here for my part of the lead discussion is to think about this question of scale. So what we're talking about here in the case of ALU is one institution. What we're talking about in terms of the Alliance is a group of institutions. But obviously, if you look across all universities in the world, it's a minority that we're talking about. I'd love your impressions as to whether this is something that you think should be scaled, that, you know, would it be helpful to the world if we could replace the current dominant model of higher education with alternative models everywhere? Would that help to address problems you see in the sector with huge problems we see in the world? Or do you think that these models are powerful precisely because they lie at the margins and are not the mainstream? Do you think there might be a danger to scaling up these models, I suppose? And related to that, if we were to go with the scaling up option, if that is what you think we should do, is there anything that you would worry we might lose if we were to replace some of the more dominant, we get that more dominant model that we can see around the world? So Udi and Kelly, I don't know if you want to share this one or who wants to speak on that.
I'll start and then let Udi finish. I mean, I think I kind of hinted at it before, but I think for us, one way of thinking about this, we've talked a lot within the Alliance, is a scaling across approach. So not scaling up, but scaling across, and really issues of legitimacy, because most of these places aren't known. Most of them are completely ignored. And so how, instead of thinking just more and more of them, how can it be that they're just known, that they become something more legitimate, legitimate ways of learning, knowing? I mean, everything, you know, you're talking about too at ALU with the importance of leadership, experiential learning, we're also thinking about, and, you know, kind of recapturing what experiential learning means as well, because I think that's become a very tokenistic term. You know, what is deep, what is place-based learning that actually contributes to the communities where you are? I mean, for us, scaling across, scaling up, even that approach is really important, especially for leadership, especially for individuals and communities to have a better sense of themselves, healing mechanisms from continued, you know, colonial forms of oppression, which a lot of the Ecoversities have arisen out of. A lot of them have arisen out of trauma and violence through a creative and hopeful way to then be able to work more closely together to address real ongoing problems. So for us, it's really, how can more of these places just become known and legitimate? And not to take over the model, not to completely reject model, but now as it is, we do have a model that's seen as legitimate and a lot of the others are not. So how can we kind of break that apart and just open up the walls? And again, going back to this idea of the cosmopolitical, learning within and between and from different types of knowledge systems to address the massive problems and crises that we're all facing on various levels. I don't know, Udi, if you want to add more on that, but
I mean, just very briefly, just to say, yeah, in terms of obviously the scale of the higher education sector, the you know, the billions of dollars in it, and billions of people in it too. We have it's very clear that we need a real diversity of different models, and that there's no one thing as the university. Obviously, in different parts of the world, the university is manifested in different ways. But just to, I mean, adding a little bit to what Kelly was saying, that some of the critiques that we mentioned and Kelly addressed about the neoliberal, the ecological, the epistemological, I think one thing that these places do manage to operate in the margins or in the gaps, in the cracks, is that they are great sites for experimentation. Right, experimentational in terms of leadership, in terms of pedagogy, in terms of relationship to community, in terms of creating different forms of culture, different, we call it relationality. So different ways of relating, both within the learners, with faculty and learners, and all of that within a context of community. So I think that I would argue more for the multiple university models and this ecology of knowledges, like Kelly was saying, to just be more mindful of what's happening in these places and learn with and from these places too. So without necessarily this idea of, you know, everything being completely overturned, but just to building more these channels of mutual learning and connection. I think that would be my, what I'd advocate for.
Do you want to come in, Nhlanhla, on that?
Yeah, I thought long and hard about this angle, and I've settled for the middle position, namely having spent my time on both the traditional and these entrepreneurial models, I think that there is value for having multiple university missions and visions and values. I'm not a person who really is interested in homogeneity. I think that diversity is a good thing, so I think that we're not trying to remove anything, we're trying to expand the options of what is available so that various people with different interests can choose what suits them. Okay, and I think that that is the most important contribution we're making. Of course, there's a question of supply and demand. If at some point, as I hope, more people favor these models, then of course you then become the dominant model. But my hope is that we will have multiple types of universities with different missions addressing different aspects, because combined they add value. Okay, what we don't want is symmetry, where we have only just one model of knowing as well as a model of a university. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. And of course, there's a particular irony as we see more convergence, a move exactly in the opposite direction from what you're saying. But I think one thing that's useful about having conversations like this is to shine the light, as you say, on the places that do exist and make sure we don't forget that they do exist when we talk about convergence and isomorphism in higher ed. So we do have a few questions coming in from the audience. So usually on these webinars, I read them just in the interest of time. So that's what I'll do. A few are aimed at specifics, and actually they're all aimed specifically. I don't think we have any questions right now that are general, although one of them I'll turn to general. I have two for you, Nhlanhla, so I'll ask them together if that's okay. So David McCarty asked, from your experience, how does African leadership compare and contrast with Western concepts of leadership? Is there a difference? Has the university defined a distinct African style or approach to leadership or not? And then the other question for you, also from David, is if graduates are often unemployable, how does implementing a student-driven system address this? How can you be assured that what the students want to learn aligns with what employers are looking for example, what inputs do business, industry, et cetera, provide into student learning outcomes, if any, at ALU? So those are two ALU specific questions. And I'll ask you one as well, Udi and Kelly, and then maybe we can take them in turn. Also from David, can you provide us with any tangible examples of some outcomes that have come out of the Alliance? There's another question from Jackie Gardina, but I think I can ask that one across the two of you. So I'll start with those. So Nhlanhla, do you want to start with the ALU questions?
Yeah, I guess this is an interesting question around we don't have African leadership. In other words, leadership that is African by its virtues or qualities and so on. We have leadership for Africa. So in other words, we're looking at leadership in the context of the African socio-economic space. What are the challenges that face Africa and what are the issues we should be dealing with in leadership in Africa? So one of those things is ethical leadership, entrepreneurial leadership, but we also want to add a very simple one, Pan-African leadership. In other words, collaborating across the African continent in order to deliver a continent as a geographic space, so that the African continent can thrive. It's not necessarily really about a certain leadership that is of African in its qualities. No, it's just making sure that Africa gets leaders who lead within the context of what Africa needs. There is no difference in terms of concepts of leadership with Western or Eastern and so on. Of course, there are cultural nuances to that, but not necessarily at a high level. So the other question is around employability of students, and then how does this, okay, let me explain this. We normally think about the exits of students as in three broad categories. Students will exit largely to employment, of course, that's true. And then the question is, if they are exiting to employment, how does our education system help them with employment? Then the other exit is they exit with their own venture. They may get some funding to start their own small enterprise, and then they don't need jobs then. So we've cut from the unemployment lines with students who become employers vis-a-vis employment seekers. And then there are those who go to graduate school. And evidence really suggests that students who go to graduate school have an easier time getting jobs. So let's go back to category number one, those who want to go to employment. The point of all of the education is for the students to create artifacts and evidence of solving problems, which can then put them in the front of the line in terms of employability. Every employer wants someone who can add value, okay? And we really, really focus on the students demonstrating their ability to add value. You can do entrepreneurship outside or within organizations. So our students, we try at least to teach them to be problem solvers in the context in which they work so that they can add value. That makes it easy for them to be employable, as opposed to waiving some grades and a CV and a transcript and saying, please hire me because I have a degree. The question is, hire me because I can do the following. I've studied your organization. This is the value that I can add within your organization. That's why we're focusing on that in order not to add to the unemployment lines.
Thank you so much. Udi and Kelly, do you want to take the Alliance question?
Sorry, we were still on mute. I think just to start with that, I mean, we actually are writing up reports on on what the tangible outcomes are all the time, but and some of it is less, well, like education is generally, some is very tangible, some is more kind of long term, but because of the priorities and values of emergence and relationality, there's been a whole host of new learning spaces, new relationships, new alliances that have come together through the process of meeting together, getting to know each other. We have a Germinator circle that has lent its support both in terms of skills, also very meager financial, but to help groups just get started and get out there. We have a pollinator circle just trying to spread the word in different kinds of contexts. I mean, even in this context, for people who don't know anything about this alliance, because what we have found, also I found in teaching, in fact, that led to our whole journey out, is instead of just teaching, you know, the critiques of education, the critiques of international development, as soon as I was teaching through hopeful examples that are based on critique, whole other level of imagination, a whole other level of excitement and energy, and that's what we found within the Alliance too. So it's not to say we're not going to focus on the problems. We definitely do. We need to. They're extremely important. But you need to balance that with, you know, hopeful examples of how ingenuity and relationality, solidarity are really coming together to build examples of various forms of spaces that are actually addressing this. And just one small example is the only reason Udi and I are in Hawaii is we came here to work with a member of the Alliance we've known now since the beginning. She's Native Hawaiian. She has started her own Ecoversity here that's for Native Hawaiians. Also kind of, I think ALU, there's a lot of similarities. It's based on local leadership, local entrepreneurialism. It's for Native Hawaiians, and the name is EA Ecoversity. EA is an acronym for Education of Aloha, and it's also a word in Hawaiian which means sovereignty of self, sovereignty of place, sovereignty of community. And so what she has started here has been supported by the Alliance and wouldn't exist otherwise, or it might, but I mean, it's come together in a much more solid, hopeful way. And there's numerous examples around this all over the world. And we've been working with her in different sorts of ways that, you know, so all these relationships just have built some unexpected and also expected outcomes, which have been really exciting.
Yeah, just quickly, two bits to add. One is, when we talk about relationality, we do mean that there are different ways of relating and being together and being with each other and learning from each other that have been really, really key in the Alliance. And we are creating a different kind of culture, right? So it's a very diverse culture that is learning between ourselves in different ways. And I think I can't emphasize enough the importance of that and how few spaces there are out there in the world for this kind of encounter to happen. So I think that's one key part of the Alliance that continues to surprise us and create, you know, amazing things. And the other is, which was one of the original I guess, visions of the Alliance in the first place, which is to create visibility for these different experiments which are happening around the world. So if you look at our website, which has been posted there on the chat, you can see we have a very vibrant publications and films section of things being generated by this ecosystem of the Alliance to show more what's happening in these multiple places around the world, in very concrete learning places, and what their results are as well.
And sorry, just one thing to add too, is one of the principles and values we've held and really tried to practice in each of the gatherings is to actually, it's often through an unconference kind of a format, but it's also to meet up at a site of an ecoversity. So a site that's either beginning or really flourishing. So we're learning in the place as much as we are meeting together in a more kind of very informal way. I mean, very informal. There's lots of stories around that, but I think, and that's also helped inspire, new experiments, but also kind of confidence in possibilities. So
I think you've started to address part of Mark Johnson's question and that he posted in the chat. He said, be enormously useful for all of us in the US to open up the conversation about specific colleges and universities that are doing this kind of work. And there's some representation of that in professional associations and other networks, but there's a question about how we can all connect beyond that. So I think you started to talk about some of the ways that you've connected within the Alliance, but did any of the three of you have any thoughts about how this kind of sharing can happen in a way that opens the space for higher education in the way that you want to see it open? I don't know who wants to go first. Maybe Udi and Kelly, you were already talking about it. So if you have anything else to add on that.
Yeah, sure. So we've, with the focus on a kind of a more decentralized way of, well, increasingly decentralized way of organizing. I mean, we do have these international gatherings, but we've really been focusing more on regional. We have actually had a North American gathering. There's been 2 Pacific Island gatherings, multiple gatherings in Latin America. And we tried to get more people working together within and across North America. It's been a slower area. But I mean, for us, it's just creating a space for that and getting people there. So that's been one of the main things, and just trying to spread the word. I mean, because there are people already within the Alliance from across North America, within some micro colleges, within some more mainstream, within really kind of informal learning spaces, meeting together, getting to know each other, building solidarity. That's definitely been one aspect. Another one is speaking in spaces that are more formal. I mean, for example, I went to a big conference at Columbia University on education for sustainable development and sustainable development goals. There was a whole 3-day panel on higher education, on what is sustainability in higher education. I spoke about Ecoversities. No one there knew anything about it. And it was like, whoa, this is happening. We don't know anything about this, because everyone was primarily talking about how can you sneak it into the curriculum? How can you make the campus infrastructure more sustainable? But that's the kind of thing we try to do, is just, this exists. We're here. You're welcome to join or get to know something about it. And that's been our approach all along. And so far it's worked, but it's small. So, in terms of the scaling up, again, it's fine for us because we kind of also have the confidence that things do emerge as they're meant to. But yes, Mark, we'd love to have you on board to organize something again in North America soon. It'd be great.
Do you want to say anything on connections or communication?
Yeah, we participate in an initiative started by the UN, which is an association of entrepreneurial universities in Africa. That's the space where we share ideas with other universities in the continent who are also trying to work in these areas. But we also have partnerships with industry as well as other universities to exchange students. We have partnerships with Hull University in the UK. Hull University, we have partnerships with other universities who are like-minded, quite a long list of those. But also the faculty exchanges, another domain in which we share ideas about how to improve both learning, but also the experiential learning side. A key area that is really, really underdeveloped and that we're really also trying to develop here is the issue of assessments. How do you develop relevant assessments in a model of this sort where students are distributed, they're not in the same place, and then you are not there to put them in a room and watch that they are actually taking the exam. So assessment is an area that is an area of development, and we're spending a bit of time researching that area to see how we can improve that. Yeah, thank you.
That's where some of the pressure points probably come to bear, how you, how quality is understood in different ways and how you can prove that you are of a sufficient quality without having entrepreneurial innovation squashed. Thank you. Whichever of you just posted that, I was just going to post that journal article, or that journal on alternative models, because there's a lot in that as well, which is another way we can communicate. I think we have only a couple minutes left, but there are two sort of themes that have come through in the questions that I'm going to ask them both, and I would say address whichever one you are interested in addressing. So one, there's a question about, there's a couple of questions that are around funding. So the other part of Mark's question was around whether, is there any hope for changing the way aid works or the way exchanges works? That's a whole other webinar, I think. But in terms of thinking about funding of the institutions you work with, clearly funding pressures are one of the things that are leading to convergence in parts of the world. So how funding is handled in your different institutions might be something that I think people in the audience might be interested in hearing more about. The other question was just about how learning is understood or conceptualized. Jackie's question to you, Nhlanhla, was on whether this is competency-based education or whether you're thinking about it in a different way. I think there's also ways that learning is understood in some of the universities linked to the Alliance as well. So I don't know, I think either, we probably don't have time to do both with both, but I'll give you each a last word, whether you want to address one of those or anything else that you want to close with. Udi and Kelly, do you mind if I come to you first?
No, not at all.
Right.
I think just, the funding question is really important, and we haven't really talked about that yet. I'll just say briefly that as part of the experimentation within the Alliance, we've actually had a series of seminars, webinars, together learning within the solidarity economy, so alternative forms of economic financial practices. The gift economy has been a really important and very successful model of engagement, which is an ancient form of practice too, and that's some of the stuff we're trying to bring together. And I think it's important to say that instead of looking at it only that we don't have enough, which I think we tend to think and tend to have the perspective because of the way we've been socialized within the Western system, is that we look at it in forms of abundance. What's there between us? What can we share? What are we willing to offer time-wise? And so it's a different way of offering. I mean, we've done a lot with very, very little. In fact, when you look at the numbers and all that has come in terms of meeting together, publications, germinating projects, it's a huge amount with very little money as part of that. And at the same time, each of the Ecoversities, which you can find on the website, have very different examples. Some are more kind of standard but lower cost, and some are very experimental. Pay it forward, for example, time banking, like different solidarity economy models that are then put into practice and experimented with. So do you want to have any? And I think, sorry, finally, last thing to say too is in terms of the learning, I think one easy way that we've had to think about it and practice is moving from the head-based learning, which universities are, is thinking about it in terms of head, hands, heart, but also home. Those 4 H's have been kind of the way of thinking about our approach to learning, and any kind of competency or assessment methods and means, again, is a very diverse array of approaches, which you'll find that is also diverse within the places that exist within the Alliance.
Thank you so much. Nhlanhla, last word from you. I don't know which one you want to tackle.
We fundraise a lot. We know that our students can normally not afford education, so fundraising will remain a huge part of what we do. We give almost 70% of the students that come to us get some funding. In terms of learning, yes, it is competence, but it's not only competence. It's competence plus all the other elements. You must understand what you're doing from a theoretical perspective, but you must also understand the relevance of what we are doing in the context. So it's not just competence alone, it's competence plus.
Thank you so much. And thank you for, I kind of can't believe we stuck to time. There's so much we could have talked about all evening, to be honest. I think let's have another hour on the role of faculty. Let's have another hour just on many things that I think could come out of this dialogue. But thank you so much for a vibrant conversation. Our goal in putting this webinar together was to be a little bit provocative and maybe challenge us to confront our assumptions about what constitutes higher education a little bit. I mean, what it is, what it's for, what elements must be there in order for it to be considered higher education. I think those are questions that we don't always engage with as much as we should as a field. And I hope that, of course, there's myriad models of higher education all over the world, many of which are not represented here. But my hope was that this panel would represent quite a diversity on the spectrum from, quite an unbundled type of university to more indigenous models, et cetera, all represented within the groups that you work with. So thank you so much once again for being here, all three of you. And thank you to the audience for coming on board and asking questions. We hope you'll stay engaged with us. We don't have any other webinars planned for the next few weeks as we head into the busyness of the end of the year and graduation here at Boston College, but there will be more coming soon, and we hope we see many of you at those. So thank you so much again, and have a good night, evening, morning, wherever you may be. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.